My son's body was still warm when my daughter-in-law placed a stack of documents in front of me. I could still smell the hospital antiseptic on my hands. My knees were weak. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the sound of the machines beeping had not even faded from my ears. My son, Michael, had died less than 30 minutes earlier. While I was holding his hand and whispering prayers, Sabrina, his wife, was dabbing her eyes with a tissue and telling me, Michael didn't want financial chaos. He said if something happened to him, you needed to sign these papers immediately to protect Sophia. Sophia, my only granddaughter, the last remaining piece of my son. My hands were shaking so badly that the pen nearly fell from my grip. I didn't read the paper. I signed because I was no longer thinking like a businesswoman. I was thinking like a broken mother who would agree to anything if it meant keeping her family from falling apart. What I didn't know was that with those signatures, I had just transferred $167 million in assets, trust accounts, and property holdings directly into Sabrina's control. I had legally made myself powerless, and Sabrina didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. While I was still wiping tears from my face, she leaned back in the hospital chair, folded the paper, and said, "Thank you. Michael would be proud of you." That was the first moment I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. Relief, not grief. But destiny has its own way of revealing truth, even when evil thinks it has already won. 2 days after the funeral, while I was still trying to breathe through the pain of losing my only son, I received a call that would change everything. It was from Daniel Reeds, the paramedic who had closed Michael's eyes in the ambulance. His voice was calm but heavy. He said, "Mrs. Marsh, I need to show you something. It's about your son's final words." My heart stopped. I didn't know whether to feel hope, fear, or both. When Daniel arrived at my home, he carried his emergency response recorder, a body cam device that captures all medical interactions from the moment paramedics reach a patient. He sat across from me in my living room, his eyes full of empathy, and said, "Michael knew he was dying. He wanted you to know the truth." He pressed play. There was my son, weak, barely conscious. He was struggling to breathe, each word costing him strength he barely had. His voice was faint, but every syllable was clear enough to break me all over again. "Mom, she's the one who—" His voice cracked. He paused, as if gathering his last strength. Then, with unmistakable effort, he whispered words that made my blood run cold. That was the moment I realized my son had not left this world in silence. He had tried to warn me. His last breath had not been a goodbye. It had been a truth powerful enough to expose everything I had refused to see. Before I tell you what he said next, I want you to think about this. What would you do if the person you trusted as family turned out to be the one who destroyed everything you love? Stay with me, because once you hear what my son revealed, you'll never look at trust the same way again. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe now, because this story will open your eyes to a truth most people never see until it's too late. My name is Evelyn Marsh. I am 61 years old, and for the past 30 years, I have been the CEO of Marsh Hospitality Group, a hotel empire that started as a single roadside inn my late husband and I purchased when we had barely enough in our savings account to cover the down payment. We built our life brick by brick, room by room, and when my husband passed away, I made a promise to honor his dream and continue building in his name. What people often fail to understand is that money doesn't shield you from heartbreak. Power doesn't protect you from betrayal. Love, when placed in the wrong hands, can become the very weapon that destroys your life. My son, Michael, was my greatest pride. He wasn't interested in boardrooms or luxury. Instead, he chose a life of service. He became a pediatric surgeon, dedicating his life to saving children who had no one else to fight for them. He lived modestly, never flaunting his connection to wealth. He often said to me, "Mom, you build places where people rest. I want to be the person who helps them live." That was Michael, steady, pure-hearted, the kind of man this world doesn't deserve. When he introduced me to Sabrina, I welcomed her without hesitation. She was soft-spoken, elegant, and always presented herself as deeply devoted to Michael and their daughter, Sophia. She called me Mom from the first week we met. She would hug me every time she saw me, bring me tea, ask me for advice. She played the perfect daughter-in-law so well that I often found myself thanking God for sending her. In the beginning, everything felt like a blessing. We were a family united, not just by blood, but by love. Michael had a daughter, Sophia, the light of my life, a gentle 5-year-old who loved coloring on my office paperwork and telling her father, "You save the kids, and I'll save the puppies." My world was full. My heart was full. But looking back, I now realize that while I saw Sabrina as family, she saw us as assets. Slowly, things began to shift. Sabrina started controlling access to Michael. She said he needed rest and didn't want visitors. She canceled family dinners, telling me Michael was too tired after work. When I asked Michael directly, his responses became vague. "Mom, Sabrina just worries about me. She means well." I wanted to believe that. I ignored the unease in my chest, the same way a person ignores distant thunder, thinking the storm will pass without reaching them. I was wrong. Michael's health began to decline, but every time I offered help, Sabrina said, "It's just stress. He doesn't want to worry you." She kept saying the word worry, as if she were shielding me. But what I didn't realize was that she wasn't trying to shield me from pain. She was trying to isolate Michael from protection. Behind every gentle smile, she was hiding a plan, and I was too blinded by trust to see it. The first real crack in the illusion began with a phone call at 4:12 a.m. I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand. My heart sank the instant I saw Sabrina's name. Her voice on the other end was panicked, but there was something underneath it, something too controlled. "Evelyn, it's Michael. He collapsed. They're taking him to the hospital. Please hurry." Before I could ask a single question, the call ended. I arrived at St. Matthew's Hospital within minutes. As I rushed through the emergency room doors, I saw Sabrina sitting in a chair with her head down, not in tears, not shaken, but holding her phone, whispering something I couldn't hear. When she looked up at me, she quickly forced herself into a crying state and collapsed into my arms. They said he went into cardiac distress. He wouldn't take his medication. I told him this would happen, she said, as though she had already prepared the line. My son was in a state of critical decline, yet Sabrina seemed more focused on explaining herself than on his condition. I pushed past her and followed the nurses into the trauma room. Michael lay on the gurney, pale, his lips slightly blue, every breath a struggle. His eyes fluttered open for a moment when I took his hand. He looked at me with a kind of desperation I had never seen in him. He tried to speak, but a nurse told him to conserve his energy. Then a paramedic stepped forward, Daniel, as I learned later, and said, "He spoke a few words in the ambulance. We recorded it." He didn't say more, but his eyes stayed on me a second longer than usual, as if he was silently telling me not to ignore that detail. Michael was stabilized briefly, but his blood pressure and heart rate were dangerously abnormal. Sabrina stayed in the corner, not at his side. She occasionally glanced over, then back to her phone. I overheard her whispering, "Yes, she's here now. I'll make sure it's done today. Just have them ready." I had no idea who she was talking to or what she was referring to, but a coldness swept through me. After Michael was wheeled into the ICU, Sabrina turned to me with red eyes, red not from tears, but from rubbing. She gripped my arm and said in a firm, urgent tone, "Evelyn, Michael told me before he lost consciousness that he wants everything secured immediately for Sophia. He wanted you to transfer all financial control into my name until she comes of age. He knows you're grieving and emotional, so he asked me to make sure you don't hesitate." Her voice was calm, too calm for someone who had just watched her husband nearly die. She pulled out a folder of neatly printed legal documents. The signatures already had timestamp lines filled in with that day's date, as if someone had been preparing for this exact moment. I stared at the pages. They weren't temporary guardianship forms. They were asset transfers, trust dissolutions, and property allocations, all leading to Sabrina. The language was complex, but I knew financial writing well. I built an empire from reading contracts exactly like this. And yet, Sabrina said, Michael doesn't trust anyone else to protect Sophia the way I can. You know I'd never hurt him. It wasn't the words that alarmed me. It was the pressure, the way she kept saying immediately, the way she invoked Michael's name in every sentence, as though she was reading from a script he had supposedly dictated. I refused to sign. I told her I would wait until Michael regained consciousness to confirm his wishes. And for a moment, her perfect facade slipped, her expression tightened. Her eyes went sharp and cold. But just as quickly, she covered it and stepped back, saying, "Of course, Evelyn. I'm just doing what Michael asked." Hours passed. Michael coded twice. The third time, they couldn't bring him back. The moment he was pronounced dead, Sabrina let out a scream that echoed down the hallway. She fell to the floor, shaking. Nurses rushed to help her, but she screamed louder, grabbing my hand, shouting, "He died knowing you refused his final request." Her words stabbed at me, not because I believed her, but because she said them so loudly, so publicly, making me appear responsible for my son's suffering. Minutes later, while I stood frozen next to my son's lifeless body, she pushed a pen into my hand again. "Sign it now, Evelyn," she said softly. Michael didn't want chaos. That was the moment I realized something horrifying. Sabrina wasn't reacting to loss. She was executing a plan, and I had just stepped into the center of it. Grief can paralyze a person, but sometimes it becomes the very force that awakens their deepest instincts. For me, the turning point wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was a subtle shift inside me, the moment when pain turned into clarity. After Michael's death, I allowed myself to be led by shock and guilt. Sabrina had taken advantage of that, and she had taken nearly everything with my bank accounts were locked. My business shares were legally reassigned. Even my access to Sophia was placed under review, as if I were a threat instead of a grieving grandmother. But as Sabrina celebrated her new status as controlling guardian of the Marsh estate, she overlooked the one thing she could never fully control: truth. 3 days after Michael's death, I received a call that would change everything. The paramedic, Daniel Reeds, asked if he could meet me privately. His voice held a seriousness that made my pulse quicken. We met at a small cafe near the beach. It was a peaceful setting, almost painfully gentle compared to the storm inside me. Daniel walked in, holding a small device in his hand. He didn't sit immediately. He looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Ma'am, I believe your son was trying to tell you something before he died. I think he knew what was happening to him." He placed the device between us and pressed play. There it was, the last recording of my son alive. His voice was weak, slurred, but determined. "Mom, she's the one who—" I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. Then his voice gained a sudden urgency. "She switched my IV. Check the house cameras. Don't let her near Sophia. Please, protect." The audio cut as Michael lost strength. My heart dropped. Daniel looked at me with compassion. "We see cases sometimes where medication is tampered with. He wanted you to know." I asked, "Why are you showing me this?" He replied, "Because your son didn't die naturally, and because the woman who claimed to love him was the only one administering his care at home." The world around me seemed to blur. For the first time, everything made horrific sense. The isolated care, the refusal to allow hospital stays, the insistence on homemade medication and IV fluids. Sabrina had been positioning Michael's death as inevitable, while carefully ensuring she had legal control the moment he took his last breath. But Michael had known. Even in his final moments, he was fighting, not for himself, but for the truth. Fueled by his last words, I went home and began investigating. I accessed the smart home system logs that Michael had installed, a system Sabrina assumed I didn't know about. There it was. Footage of Sabrina entering Michael's private medication cabinet late at night. Logs showed dosage changes on his IV machine that were never approved by his doctor. Even worse, I found audio clips of Sabrina rehearsing conversations, saying, "If he goes tonight, I must make Evelyn sign immediately. She'll be too devastated to argue." The anger that built inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt. Not wild, not reckless. Cold, clear, focused. My next step was to bring my brother Anthony into the fight. A retired firefighter, he had seen enough tragedy in his lifetime to recognize calculated evil. When I showed him the recordings, he clenched his fists and said, "We're not grieving anymore. We're going to war." Together, we contacted my legal advisor, Mr. Abbott, a man who had fought for my company during its early years. His face went pale as he reviewed the documents Sabrina made me sign. These papers were not guardianship agreements. They were full asset transfers. She didn't just manipulate you emotionally. She orchestrated a legal heist. We filed an emergency petition to freeze all accounts transferred during the period of undue emotional coercion. Mr. Abbott pressed charges for fraud, coercion, and unlawful medical interference. But I knew that financial charges were not enough. I needed proof that Michael's death was not a tragedy, but a homicide. With the court order, we petitioned for a secondary autopsy. Sabrina fought aggressively to block it, showing up in court with fake tears and claiming, "My husband didn't want his body disturbed." But this time, I was no longer silent. I stood before the court and said, "Your Honor, my son's final recorded words indicate he believed someone altered his medical treatment. I will not bury the truth with him." The courtroom fell silent. The judge approved the autopsy. In that moment, everything shifted. This was no longer a story about loss. This was a story about uncovering murder. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, not because I was free from grief, but because I finally understood my purpose. My son had left me one final mission, to finish the sentence he could not, and I was ready to speak every word of truth he died trying to say. The morning the autopsy results were released, the sky outside was unusually still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in my attorney's office, my brother beside me, as the medical examiner entered with a sealed report in his hand. His expression alone told me everything before he spoke a word. "Mrs. Marsh," he said soberly as he sat across from me, "your son's death was not caused by natural heart failure. The toxicology results found high concentrations of unprescribed sedatives and a rare compound often used in hospital anesthetics. These substances were administered gradually in increasing doses over time. This was intentional poisoning." My breath caught in my chest. Even when I had suspected it, hearing it confirmed felt like being plunged into ice. My son had been killed, and the woman responsible had been sleeping under the same roof, smiling in my face, hugging my granddaughter. But it wasn't just the poisoning. Buried in the files were medical access logs from the hospital, showing that Sabrina had used her temporary spouse access card to administer pain relief doses when no doctor had approved them. She had knowingly introduced substances that caused respiratory suppression, exactly what led Michael into cardiac arrest. She didn't fail to save him. She caused him to die. With the evidence secure, the time had come to confront her, not with emotion, but with truth that could not be escaped. My attorney arranged a mandatory mediation meeting disguised as a final financial hearing. Sabrina arrived wearing a black dress and a pearl necklace, her hair styled with precision. To an outsider, she was the portrait of a grieving wife. But on that day, her careful performance began to crack the moment she saw that I was no longer broken. She tried to start with control. "Before we proceed," she said gently to the room, "I need everyone to know I have acted only out of love for Michael and Sophia." Her tone changed when she noticed the presence of two uniformed officers in the corner. Her eyes darted around the room. Her breathing quickened. We began with the financial evidence. My lawyer projected the documents she had made me sign, showing how she had transferred full ownership of my hotels, trusts, and liquid assets into her private accounts. She attempted to speak, but was silenced when a second screen lit up, this time showing smart home footage. There she was, late at night, adjusting Michael's IV line while he slept, wearing gloves, looking over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Sabrina stood up from her chair abruptly, her voice turning sharp. "You had no right to record me in my own home," she yelled. But before she could continue, the room filled with the sound of Michael's voice, the recording from that final ambulance ride. "Mom, she's the one who switched my IV. She told me it would help me rest, but I can't feel my chest." If I don't wake up, protect Sophia. Don't trust her." Sabrina's eyes widened in shock. The voice of the man she killed, the man she had hoped to silence, filled the room like a spirit calling for justice. She stumbled backward, shaking her head. "He was confused. He didn't know what he was saying," she insisted. But then my attorney played the final piece of evidence, the autopsy report, naming her as the only individual with access to the controlled substance found in his bloodstream. Panic erupted in her voice. "You don't understand. I had to do it. He was going to leave me. He found out I used his identity to move the money. Everything was going to be taken from me." The confession tumbled out before she realized what she had said. The officer stepped forward, her face twisted into pure rage and desperation. "He owed me that life. I built everything with him," she screamed, exposing her true nature to the room. She was no longer pretending. The greed that consumed her spilled into the open. As the officers placed the cuffs on her wrists, she still tried to reach for control. "Evelyn, if you put me in prison, you'll never see Sophia again," she hissed. I stood up and faced her calmly. "Sophia will never again be in the hands of the woman who killed her father. You didn't just take a life, you tried to erase his voice, but you failed." They led her out of the room as she kicked and fought, screaming Michael's name in a twisted mockery of grief. The door closed behind her, and an overwhelming silence washed over us. It wasn't peace, it was justice. The kind of justice that comes not from revenge, but from truth, finally standing unchallenged. In that moment, I placed my hand over my heart and silently thanked my son. Even in death, he protected us. His final words had cut through every lie, every manipulation, every trap she had laid. Michael didn't die voiceless. His last breath became the very weapon that brought his killer to light. When the courtroom doors closed behind Sabrina and the echo of her screams faded into the distance, I felt the deepest silence I had ever known. Not a silence of grief, but of revelation. Justice had been delivered not by chance, but because truth refused to die with my son. The legal victory restored my assets, but what mattered more was that it restored Michael's dignity. The world would not remember him as a man who died suddenly. They would remember him as a man who fought for truth, even in his final breath. A man who used his last moments to protect his mother, his daughter, and his legacy. Yet even as justice settled over the case like a final seal, I understood that my life would never return to what it once was. My son's chair at my dining table remained empty. His laughter no longer echoed through my home, but for the first time since losing him, I didn't feel helpless. I felt called. After Sabrina's conviction, I gained full guardianship of my granddaughter, Sophia. The first night she stayed in my home, she climbed into my lap and asked softly, "Grandma, is Daddy watching us from heaven?" I held her close and said, "Yes, sweetheart, and he is smiling because you are safe now." Those words were not just a comfort to her. They were a promise to him. I vowed to raise her with love, truth, and the strength her father lived by. I wanted her to grow up knowing the real story of her father, not the lies her mother spun, but the truth of a man who cared more about saving lives than controlling them. But healing was not immediate. Grief comes in waves, sometimes soft and sometimes sharp enough to steal your breath. The mornings were the hardest. I would wake up expecting a call from Michael out of habit, then remember he was gone. Each time, the pain returned, but so did determination. My son had given everything to protect others. The least I could do was honor his final wish, to prevent this from ever happening to another family. Within 6 months, I launched the Michael Marsh Foundation, a national organization dedicated to supporting families affected by medical abuse, financial coercion, and domestic manipulation. Our mission was clear: to empower victims through legal aid, financial education, and emergency protection services. The story of my son's final recorded words went viral across the nation, not because of sensationalism, but because people saw themselves in it. Thousands of messages poured in: widows who had been manipulated into signing away their homes, elderly parents targeted by greedy spouses of their children, and even young people who feared they were being slowly harmed by those who claimed to love them. In every one of their voices, I heard echoes of my son's final plea. As months passed, the media moved on, but the impact of the case did not fade. Hospitals implemented stricter medication access protocols. Lawmakers began drafting new legislation to protect families from coercive inheritance fraud. I testified before Congress, not as a business mogul, but as a mother who had lived the nightmare of watching love be weaponized. As I spoke, I felt Michael beside me, present in every word, guiding every sentence. But for all the progress, I knew the most important victory was personal. One evening, after putting Sophia to bed, I sat on the porch overlooking the ocean. The sky was kissed with orange and gold as the sun began to set. In that quiet moment, I whispered, "Michael, I finished what you started." Your voice was heard. A soft breeze brushed against my face, warm and gentle. And in that moment, I didn't feel alone. I felt connected to purpose, to truth, to my son's spirit that lived on, not in memory, but in action. Pain had changed me, but it had not defeated me. Betrayal had wounded me, but it had not silenced me. If anything, it awakened a strength I never knew I had. The strength to stand against manipulation, the strength to fight for justice, and the strength to turn personal tragedy into a shield for others. This story does not end with loss. It ends with legacy. My son's last words were not just a warning. They were a command for, and as long as I live, I will carry that command forward so that no voice is ever silenced by greed and no life is ever stolen in the name of inheritance. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring hidden stories to light and gives a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves.